Alright, so we're just going to get started now. Okay, thank you all very much for coming. So here's Dr. Jay Hosking. He specializes in neuroscience. He's also a musician and an author. In 2016, he published his debut novel, 3 Years with a Rat, through which he combined his neuroscience PhD with his master's in creative writing. According to one of the most popular book reviews online, Goodreads.com, 3 Years with a Rat is simultaneously a mind-twisting mystery that plays with the very nature of time and the story of a young man who must face the dangerously destructive forces we all carry within ourselves. During Dr. Hosking's PhD at UBC, he taught rats how to gamble and studied the neurological basis of choice. Following that, he researched decision-making and the human brain as a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University. So please welcome Dr. Hosking.
Thanks for coming. If you've been one of my students before or talked to anybody who's in one of my classes, they know that I only admit the fiction stuff out of a sheepish reluctance because everybody's going to Google me anyway, right? So it's awesome to see some familiar faces here. Welcome. Thanks so much for coming. To anybody who's been in my drugs and behavior course, you've probably seen something pretty similar to this before, so you can just go now. This won't be on the test. We're all good. Thank you so much to KPS for hosting this. This is amazing. And also, super great spread there. Come on, you guys are poor. Go clean all that up. It's going to be amazing. Except for the gluten intolerant people, you're probably in trouble. So I'm going to talk about addiction today. It seems like I am quickly becoming the drugs guy at KPU. I didn't know every school needed a drugs guy, but it turns out that they do. So I'm going to be doing this, you can see, without any notes, but I've taught this before, so hopefully I won't screw it up too badly. I'm going to also have to do this a bunch. So this image here is William S. Burroughs. You might be familiar with Burroughs' The Naked Lunch. Really fantastic book, a lot of really strange books. Naked Lunch is very famous for essentially having been torn apart and then reassembled back together, so it has no real strong structure in terms of time or space. Or it's a really interesting read, but it's also very much the read. It's a read of the mind of an addict or a person who is relatively recovered. Very, very famous heroin addict. He wrote a book called Junkie, and this quote, "This one day you wake up sick," comes from that. So I'll just read that out. I don't know why, because I feel like I have to. The question is frequently asked, why does a man become a drug addict? The answer is that he usually does not intend to become an addict. You don't wake up one morning and decide to be a drug addict. It takes at least 3 months of shooting twice a day to get any habit at all. Remember, this is one guy's opinion. It's probably a little bit less than that. The questions, of course, could be asked, well, why did you ever try narcotics? Why did you continue using it long enough to become an addict? Well, you become a narcotics addict because you don't have any strong motivation in the other direction. Junk, which is another word for heroin, wins by default. I tried it as a matter of curiosity. I drifted along taking shots when I could score and ended up hooked. Most addicts I've talked to report a similar experience. They did not start using drugs for any reason that they can remember. They just drifted along until they got hooked. If you have never been addicted, you have no clear idea what it means to need junk with the addict's special need. You don't decide to be an addict. One morning you wake up sick and you're an addict. So he makes it sound like there is no great predisposition or there is no, that sheer exposure is all you need. And to a great extent, the story I'm going to tell you is about how repeated exposure predisposes us toward becoming addicted to things. But part of his story isn't really told here either, which is that he and his wife, they used to party and they were having a great time. They went to redo the William Tell trick, the shooting the apple off the head, but he did it with a pistol instead, and he accidentally shot and killed his wife, which may make you wonder if that predisposes a person to being addicted to heroin. Okay, so the things you actually care about, things that nerds like me care about a little bit less, are really about what does it look like and who gets it, who's at risk, that sort of thing. So I'm going to go into that, and we'll go into the idea of addiction being this cycle of trying to avoid withdrawal. This is a very common sense notion of it, and it makes a lot of sense that there are some sort of shortcomings or gaps within that theory. So then we'll talk about dopamine, because everybody who's been in one of my classes knows I can't shut up about dopamine. Then finally, what can we do to cure or treat addiction? Probably not very much is my answer, but there are many social programs that would be useful. It's just harder to sell people because it's not a magic pill or some sort of brain discovery. And then finally, because I know you're probably all asking yourself this question, am I addicted to food or am I addicted to video games, my smartphone, etc., etc. So I'll have a bit to say about that as well. Okay, so you've probably heard categorizations before, things like Schedule 1 drugs, or these classifications of drugs. And the idea is that it goes from sort of a most risk to least risk, but most of the early scheduling and early classification are quite old at this point, and not very accurate, and not very reflective of the research we have. So this is from a much more recent study in 2007. Sorry if the podium here is in your way at all. But what this was essentially doing, these two graphs here are showing exactly the same thing. This one is just summing up the information from the 2 dimensions on this, essentially. So what they're doing is they're looking at, one, what is the likelihood of dependence, so the biochemical things that make you get hooked on a drug, versus what potential physical harms can come to you from using this drug. And this isn't just the drug use itself, but criminal behavior, ways of trying to seek money by stealing or whatever else in order to get your next fix. And so what you find may be kind of surprising. Like, of course, heroin there is right up at the top, most likely to be highly dependent and also to cause great physical harm, and there's cocaine. But once you start to get into this orange section, you'll notice that most of these drugs here are either legal or they are prescribed. They're drugs that your doctor would give you. So amphetamine is given for ADHD, for example, Ritalin, Ritalin's a little... Anyway, but yes. You've got your benzodiazepines here. Some people, they used to call them mother's little helper. So these are your drugs that help you chill out, like Ativan or Xanax or whatever. I recently found out that there is a somewhat famous rapper named after Xanax, which I thought was hilarious, Lil Xan. There's tobacco and alcohol sort of in this intermediate category of risk and danger. And then you look in the lower category, and this is, again, a lot of these are illegal. In Toronto, there was a big push to try and eliminate khat for a while. This is a chewed leaf. It's used within certain communities, obviously in communities that are relatively new and immigrating, first or second generation individuals. But the thing is, it's a relatively little risk. It's usually used in a cultural context, and it's like sitting around having a drink of tea or something like that. So it's not quite any true danger, and it's a waste of resources, in my opinion, to be focusing on it. And then you see cannabis is there, LSD. I guess this one will be legal pretty soon. But my point here of all this is that just because something's legal or illegal, just because something's prescribed or not prescribed, doesn't give you a good idea of its addictive potential or what the problems are. So in Canada, about 75% of all people who end up addicted to heroin say they started with a prescription opioid painkiller habit to start. So they injured their knee or they hurt their shoulder or something, the doctor gave them oxycodone or something like that, and then that ended up, when that dried up, they ended up transitioning over to another opioid drug, i.e. heroin. And so you can see, this is somewhat out of date already, but buprenorphine's here, that's sort of your closest that you're going to get to oxycodone or any of those prescription painkillers. Those have been a major problem and a major crisis within Canada, and until this whole fentanyl epidemic started up, they were the main or the big drug problem. Anyway, so you get my point. Harm is a weird thing, and I don't want you to think that as long as you stay off the street drugs, you're going to be totally safe, because you're not. So who's particularly at risk, men or women, that sort of thing. So we're getting into our demographics here. In general, it's men. It depends on the drug a little bit, but it's usually 3 to 1 or 3 to 2 for men. But that number is narrowing, or that ratio is getting smaller and smaller with time. There are proportionally more and more women that are becoming addicted to drugs, so this may have some sort of historical or societal construct to it, right? We can't be sure. An additional trouble with women is this phenomenon called telescoping, which is that when women do get hooked on a substance or use something, that they tend to progress through all the stages faster. They go from using it to be fun and have a good time into using it for dependence and feel normal faster than men do. So yes, men are more at risk, but women have a unique set of risks, and that gap is closing all the time. Young or old, the answer is it doesn't really matter. You can get hooked at any age, and it seems like everybody's about roughly predisposed to. The problem in youth and in adolescence is that the longer you're exposed to a drug, then the more likely you are to get hooked on it. So if you start using in adolescence, you're much, much more likely to develop an addiction problem or a substance abuse problem in adulthood. And again, remember telescoping, so like this is somewhat less applicable to women, but still applicable. And then finally, there are a number of mental health categories, so substance abuse is predicted by whether you have some sort of underlying mental health issue, whether it's depression or anxiety or a few other disorders, but it's also the direction, it's bidirectional, so using these substances makes you more likely to later on develop depression or anxiety or other mood disorders. So it kind of works both ways. So moving into some more interesting things. So again, you hear these ugly arguments in Canada all the time, whether it's with First Nations people being predisposed to alcohol or whatever else. It's like, God, if you come from the suburbs where I do, you hear this stuff and it's just, it is so omnipresent that you just take it to be true, like the same way that wheels are round, right? But it isn't really. So there is some evidence for predisposition, at least in terms of when you look at families where there are this high levels of alcoholism, you can sort of find clusters of genes that seem to increase likelihood or increase, be somewhat of a risk factor, but there's no sort of addiction gene. There's no single gene. And these genes make sense too when you look at them. They're things like how quickly or how slowly you metabolize alcohol, things like that. And when you look at reproducibility, you probably have teachers who are much nerdier about this than I am, but when you do retest studies, you often find that a lot of these genetic markers just disappear. So you may have found them in the first study, but they don't end up being the real deal, or at least something that's statistically robust enough to show up again. And then the biggest one is right here, that if you're operating from this implicit bias of, well, people from First Nations community are predisposed to having alcohol problems, like if you start from there, then your results are going to lead from there, right? So recognizing your biases really early on is a really important part of studying addiction, especially within ethnocultural groups. And then in terms of environment, I would argue that this is the biggest one, or the most neglected one in my personal opinion. So family history is one, so if you grow up seeing your family using substances, they are much more socially acceptable, culturally acceptable, however you want to phrase it. They are normalized to you, right? So you are more inclined or more predisposed. Has anybody been panicking or worried yet that I'm going to fall right off the side? So poverty is a huge one, right? So growing up poor, food scarcity, or even having a bad run in your life and losing your job and a few other things. So in adulthood as well. Chronic stress, so I tell my students this, they never believe me, but a little bit of acute stress is a good thing. You know, when you're getting ready, when you're amping up for a test, that stress is useful. It focuses your attention, enhances your memory, actually boosts your immune system so you won't get sick until after the exam. So these are all awesome things. This is true, I'm not lying to you. But when you're chronically stressed, you're basically draining the system or exacerbating the system. So you end up being much more likely, your immune functioning goes way down, your ability to remember things goes way down, and your predisposition to be impulsive or to drink, to have that second or third or 20th beer, it goes up and up and up. And of course you can imagine if you're walking around hungover all the time and you're dealing with these other stressors, it's all going to compound, right? And then finally, this is a huge one, right? So early childhood adversity, whether it's trauma, neglect, abuse, food scarcity, poverty, you get the idea. These are huge predictors of likelihood of substance abuse later in life. Okay, so just to start dropping this in now, I'm not going to be too neuroscience heavy here, but we do have to talk a little bit about the brain. So one interesting thing to note at this point is that all addictive substances, doesn't matter what they are, if they have addictive properties, then inevitably when they're looked at within the brain, there's going to be a dopamine story. It's always the same thing, that these drugs either directly or indirectly increase dopamine functioning, specifically within this part of your brain called the midbrain, which we won't talk about too much. But this, in case you're curious, also applies to cannabis or marijuana, whatever you want to call it. So any of your friends who are burning one down and claiming that it's not addictive are either lying to themselves or lying to you. So addictive drugs sort of have this universal property to them. Okay, so when we talk about drug addiction, it's often described as a failure of willpower, right? Like if you just worked harder, you could just get around it, or if you just blah, 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 you didn't try hard enough, or you just need to, quit. This idea of quitting cold turkey. So has anybody ever tried to quit cigarettes cold turkey? Easy or hard? Terrible. Good expression for it, yeah. So it's yes, willpower can help you to some regard, but the reason why it is very, very difficult is because it isn't just challenging some weird nebulous thing, it's actually affecting your brain itself. So this long-term use of substances is changing the structure and the function within your brain itself. So this is just showing areas that are heavy in dopamine use in your brain. You can see they're sort of inside in this deep structure, and you see that with prolonged use, you're sort of weakening the overall system, or at least you are making it, you're putting it essentially in a state where you're more impulsive and more likely to use more drugs later on. So you're in a hypoactive dopamine state, and you want more of that. You're looking for your rush. So try to get away from this idea of people, substance abusers, being weak or unable to stop, right? Like in this, that it's a personal failure or a moral problem. We got to go beyond that if we actually want to deal with anything. Okay, so what does it look like? We'll just go over this very quickly. So at first, there are these often hedonic effects, right? It feels very good. A lot of drugs have a euphoric quality to them. That's not exclusively true. LSD, for example, has virtually, it can be euphoric to experience things in a different way, but it isn't necessarily directly euphoric in and of itself. Then once you've used a substance, then often you will have this sensation, this craving, this wanting to have it again. And with repeated use of a substance, you develop a tolerance. And this tolerance, what that means is, and everybody here I don't see anybody mainlining coffee, which is pretty amazing of you. I had a big 4-shot latte before I got here. But yeah, tolerance means that you go from being a 1 cup of coffee a day guy to a 7 cup of coffee a day guy. Escalation of intake, this is sort of related to tolerance, so you start using more and more and more, and trying to achieve the high you used to get. And this leads to dependence. One of the reasons I'm noting it here is because addiction and dependence are often spoken of as if they're the same thing, right? You hear the two words like they are synonymous, but dependence, what it means is that your body has some sort of physical dependence to it, and when in absence of the drug, you're going to experience negative effects. Addiction is actually more about this whole, like, it is having the shorthand of whether you are addicted to something is if it's having an adverse impact on your life and you would like to quit and those sorts of things. So like, I want to quit but I can't, it's ruining my life, or it's ruining my friendships, my social circles, things like that. So dependence and addiction are different. And then so with dependence comes withdrawal, right? So if you don't have your coffee in the morning, if you're like me, then you feel pretty bad. And then finally, relapse is a really important part of it, and it's this idea that weeks, years, decades even later, someone might go back to using the substance again. They're much more likely to. So this is a key part of substance abuse and why it's so dangerous, right? That you can be good and clean for 17 years and you just have a bad run, a bad day, or you're back in your old neighborhood or whatever, and you're like, oh, I'll just have one, it's fine, and then just totally get back on the horse again. Or back off the horse, I guess I should say. And then this is, like I said, this is sort of the important part of addiction itself, is that continued use despite adverse events in your life. Okay, so first you get drunk, then you develop a tolerance, and then in the hours when you're not getting drunk or developing your tolerance quietly or angrily by yourself as you watch the World Cup, you are thinking about drinking, especially if you're an England fan. So that it becomes this thing that you think about, and we're going to talk more about withdrawal after, but really, like in these early stages after your last drink, this is where you start to think about, you know, this idea of the hair of the dog. If I just have another drink, I'll feel a lot better. Okay, so what does this look like? Again, short definition stuff. I bet all the 3320 students are just dying in their seats right now. So what you're seeing here is that essentially when you take a drug, the effect normally looks like this. So as the dose goes up and up and up, you get more and more of the effect. In reality, what happens is that eventually this sort of tops out, depending on what we're looking at. With repeated use, what you see is that individuals, the relative effect gets weaker and weaker, so they have to take a greater and greater dose. So they have to consume more and more in order to get the same effect. So this is what we mean by tolerance. And we're all familiar with this, right? Again, with coffee or something else. There is an effect, strangely, called sensitization. You see this particularly with stimulants that you don't use all the time or you don't use very often. I'm not going to really talk about it today. Okay, so this is a really good example of tolerance. So then we're looking at, again, my favorite coffee. Just even seeing that, like, incites a little bit in me. It's terrible. So the basic idea of caffeine caffeine is that its function works on the adenosine system. So adenosine is a thing that's inside your body. It turns out that you have lots of this cellular energy called ATP, and as you use the energy in the day, these phosphate groups break off, and you're essentially left with just the adenosine part, which is kind of that. And so as you're awake longer and longer in the day, there's more and more adenosine floating around in your body. And it just turns out that you have lots and lots of adenosine receptors. That's what they're showing here, is that when you mark for where adenosine receptors are in the brain, you find out that they're everywhere. And when somebody drinks coffee, you can see that it affects nearly all of your adenosine receptors. So what's happening is that caffeine blocks these adenosine receptors. Normally, the more and more adenosine that's present, these blue guys, they tell these receptors, hey, you're sleepy, you should have a nap, you should just go and rest. But when coffee, or our friend Red Bull here, gets in the way, it blocks the adenosine receptor and prevents the sleep signal from being sent. And it turns out you have 3 or 4 different sleep systems in your brain. You know, we're an evolutionarily, we come from a long line of evolutionary development, so there are many reasons why we sleep, and this is also why you can't just use caffeine to keep yourself awake indefinitely. But for this mechanism, at least, this is how it works. But unfortunately what happens is, as we all know, that 1 cup of coffee eventually turns from being like, we take that 1 cup of coffee in the morning to feel great, and it transitions into we take that 1 cup of coffee in the morning to feel normal. And so part of the reason that's happening is because the body is, these adenosine receptors are recognizing that they're not being activated. They seem to be underactive for whatever reason, and the brain adjusts. So it sends out more adenosine receptors, and I'm going to talk about this later. Because there are more adenosine receptors, now suddenly the stray adenosines can get in there and talk, so you need to send out more Red Bulls if you want to prevent, or if you want to have those invigorating stimulant effects. And so this really gets us into our whole opponent process theory, or our withdrawal theory of addiction. This should make some sense to you, again, if you're a coffee drinker. So we use something, whether it's coffee or whatever, and after we're done using it, we go into some sort of withdrawal state, and we feel bad, and then we think about it again, and then we want to use it again, and we're getting this over and over and over cycle. So the idea is that Kube's idea, Walter Kube, came up with this. Well, a lot of people did, but he's sort of the big guy on it at UCSD, and it definitely explains some of the drugs more than others. So you're basically transitioning from taking drugs to feel normal to, or taking drugs to feel good to taking drugs to feel normal. So it used to make you feel awesome, now it just helps you get through the day. And you've probably all heard this, like, coffee helps me get through the day. Turns out if you never started drinking coffee, you'd do just as good as where you were when you started. Okay, so these are my highly technical whiteboard drawings. I hope you like them. Normally I draw all this stuff on the board. This is a reiteration of what I was saying before. So at first you have these adenosine receptors. Is my giant head in the way, or is that all right? Okay, I'm seeing nodding. So you have these squares here, which are the adenosine receptors. They're on the surface of the cells, and adenosine can just bind to them, and that makes you feel sleepy. So the end result here at baseline is that you feel sleepy. Then caffeine comes in, and it binds to them and blocks them, and thus turns them off, and thus you feel very, very awake, and all the adenosine is just floating around here doing nothing. Eventually, like I said, your body recognizes, hey, we're not getting any adenosine signals. There's something's wrong, something bad is going on. So the cells adjust by sending out even more adenosine receptors. So they have more and more, and now that means that you can have, these adenosine can find a place to bind, and if you don't want that to happen, you have to drink that 2nd cup of coffee to also block these ones. And then what happens is that if one day you wake up and you just decide to not have your coffee that morning, now you have way more of these adenosine receptors, and the adenosine is happy to bind to them, so you feel tired and irritable and terrible all day, because you basically changed the way your system works. So this is at a biological level, this is what tolerance is. This is what the idea of dependence is. And so this is how the opponent process theory of drug addiction works. It's like your first time use, you feel awesome, so the drug effect is amazing, and you have this sort of normal physiological baseline, which means that the end result of using the drug is great. But over time, I put here your nth time use, but after chronic use of the drug, your body's developed a baseline or a tolerance to it. And so when you use the drug, these two things cancel each other out, and you're at a normal level. So if you want to have that good feeling again, what you need to do is have a bigger dose of the drug. And then it counteracts the negative balance, you're left there. And then when you're in a withdrawal state, you're not taking any of the substance, but you do have that negative compensation that your body's done, that tolerance state, and so you feel terrible. Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah. So this is an intuitive theory of how addiction works, right? We're essentially trying to avoid this state, and so by trying to avoid this state, we're taking drugs all the time. And so this is especially true with the opioids. When you talk to individuals, the withdrawal effects are there within 3 doses of using oxycodone or oxycontin or any of those Percocets, any of that sort of thing. So if you are thinking, if you do end up banging yourself up and having to take these drugs, I would encourage you to use them very sparingly, because people often mistake what's going on. So they think, oh, I still feel bad, I need to keep taking these drugs a little longer. But it turns out the symptoms of the problem have gone away, and now what they're experiencing, that bad feeling, is actually just withdrawal effects from the morphine or the oxy or whatever. And so this seems to hold some weight and seems to be pretty true, but it can't really explain everything, because let's look at these withdrawal stages. So we see here that the worst withdrawal that you have, or the worst time is that first 1 to 3 days after you've stopped drinking when you're a chronic drinker. You feel terrible. I've got a friend who did this and just was, he had the tremors, and you probably heard of these before, the DTs, delirium tremens. So withdrawal effects are awful with drugs, but they go away. They go away after relatively short amounts of time. So here, 1 to 3 days is the worst for alcohol. Sort of the peak is, within a few days for the OxyContin or hydrocodones. These are your opioids, prescription opioids. Even cocaine, it's like, at longest you're talking about weeks or a month or something like that, but these are having physiological effects on you. And what happens, I'll go back 2 slides, is that eventually, in many respects, your body will go back to this. If left alone and you don't use the drugs, your body essentially goes back to the original way that the receptors were set up. It's not entirely true, but generally true. And so you have to ask yourself, if your body goes right back to this, then why do individuals like 15 or 20 years later suddenly become addicted really, really fast again? It can't explain relapse is the problem. And if you can't explain relapse, then you don't have a comprehensive theory of addiction. And so all these original ideas of detox programs, you've heard of these, right? You go to the Betty Ford Clinic or something. They're moderately successful, but I would say that 80% of the people going into a detox, I'll show you these numbers later, it usually fails. You go into detox, you come back out, and you start using again. So if it were just about drying out and getting past the withdrawal symptoms, then this wouldn't happen. So we need a more comprehensive or a smarter theory, or at least something to complement Kube's idea of opponent processes. So that's where, I love this. So good. So that's where we get into this idea of dopamine, and we're going to talk about the dopamine story very quickly, but just as a reminder go all the way back to your first year psych class. And it's this idea that many of the things we learn in life, we want to imagine this is relegated to just rats or snails or something, but it turns out humans are quite driven by these processes as well. So in operant conditioning, the idea is that you do something and you're given a reinforcer, so you're given a sugar pellet and you're like, oh, that was awesome, I should do that again. Or you do something and a bad thing stops, so it's like, oh, I was getting shocked, but when I pressed this lever, I stopped getting shocked. This is great. And so we learn to respond according to the reinforcers that are in our life, the things that are present around us. And what happens is that previously neutral stimuli that didn't have any meaning, like getting an A, what kind of 2-year-old would know what getting an A means, and yet you're all here working so hard pressing that lever to try and get an A. I love it. So what happens is that you get these things that had no value suddenly have great value. And so what we call that is incentive salience. So salience means like attention, or the attentional quality of a thing. And so over time, things that are related to a reinforcer, things that are related to your A or to a sugar pellet or whatever, like the lever or a good test, a good grade on your test, those things become high in incentive salience. They become more powerful or motivating. When you see these things, you want to work harder. That's all I need to say here. So essentially, one of the other things I'd like to sort of focus on is that when it comes to drug addiction itself, we often talk about it as being a habit, and that is true to some extent, but what you'll find in addicts when they are desperate to get the drugs is that they're extraordinarily clever, and they're being driven not by these reflexive habitual motions, but are using their best cognitive skills in order to get this drug. So it's more than just a habit, right? It is this very purposeful, goal-directed behavior. Okay, so this gets into the bane of all of my teaching existence, which is this idea that is dopamine the pleasure molecule. So remember that all of these drugs, all the addictive drugs, are increasing dopamine. So does that mean that when you have a dopamine rush, you feel good? And you've probably heard this a million times on the internet. The answer is no. I'll just let you know that in advance. And so part of where that comes from in these early studies, they placed this electrode in the rat's brain. They were actually trying to hit the brain stem, but they kind of missed. And instead hit this big bundle of fibers that were traveling from one area to another area of the brain. It turns out this area produces a lot of dopamine, this ventral tegmental area. It's like the main source of motivational dopamine in your brain. And it was projecting to this other area. So when you stimulate this bundle here, what it does is causes lots and lots of dopamine release. So these rats, they can just press a lever whenever they want, and when they press the lever, they get a stimulation of this bundle. So they're not getting food or sugar or anything, they're not getting anything. They're only getting electrical stimulation. But incredibly, these individuals in Olds Milner's study, they would press this lever at the exclusion of everything else. So they would stop paying attention to food or water or sex. They wouldn't sleep. They'd just keep pressing and pressing all day. They were intensely motivated to just keep pressing this lever. And so this sort of feeds into this idea that if they were pressing so much, it must have felt really good, right? Else would they be pressing so much? And the anecdote I often tell is that once in a while we get to do similar electrode studies in humans. So if you have an individual who has epilepsy or maybe has Parkinson's disease or something, you get to put a couple needles in. And so researchers sneak in on the side and they're like, hey, can I have 5 minutes of your time? And so they ask them about their pressing habits. And they found with one individual, he was pressing the button like crazy, just over and over and over. And so they talked to him, and they're like, oh, I guess that must have felt really good, right? That's why he kept pressing for stimulation. And he said, actually, no, it felt not very good at all. But every time I pressed the button, I felt like it was just on the tip of my tongue. I was going to remember something, but I couldn't quite remember it. So I keep pressing and pressing in hopes of remembering, but never got there. So there are my point in mentioning this is that there are many reasons to be pressing this button and ignoring food and sex or whatever else other than just pleasure. But it's still reasonable to presume at this point between drugs and between these self-stimulation studies that maybe there is some relationship between dopamine and pleasure, right? But then there's all this other weird contradictory evidence that you need to think about. So in individuals with Parkinson's disease, most of us know what this looks like. It's sort of a frozen motor behavior disorder. So you see this slow shuffling gait, inability to initiate or stop behavior. There's also things like the tremor that seems to be prevalent, but the real problem is this difficulty with initiating voluntary movement. And all of this profound behavioral phenotype, what you see individuals doing, is all just caused by the loss of just these two tiny little nuclei of neurons in the brain. So this is in the midbrain. It's an area called the substantia nigra here, the dark substance. And when those cells die, an individual has Parkinson's disease. And so what it turns out is that these cells are the other big dopaminergic area. So they are the other dopamine-producing neurons of the brain. So the loss of dopamine here doesn't cause a person to become really blue and sad and have a lower baseline level of pleasure or something like that. What it causes them to do is to have all of these motor and behavioral sort of impairments. So they're not, sometimes they are depressed, but they report that they're depressed because they can't move, which is, I think, a reasonable response. The flip side of this is having too much dopamine. So in schizophrenia, what you find is that, so this is showing the dose that a doctor would prescribe on the x-axis, and on the y is showing how well it binds. So the things that bind really well to dopamine receptors are down here, and the ones that bind really poorly are up here. So all the drugs we give are dopamine blockers, they're dopamine antagonists, they're called. And the ones that block the dopamine receptors the best are the ones that we only have to give a little bit of. They're very, very effective drugs. So the point in showing this is that it suggests that in schizophrenia, an individual has a hyperactive dopamine system. But you would never describe someone who has schizophrenia as having a higher baseline level of pleasure, right? They have disorganization of speech and thought, some problems with hallucinations sometimes, but it's not that they're running around all happy and running through a field of daisies. Certainly the opposite. And so this is my favorite one, of course, because it has rats, right? So in this one, it was really starting to be understood at this point what dopamine was really doing, but I think this is the most compelling single study to show it. So in this study, what John Salomon did is he just made this very simple T-maze task. He let the individual rats, they'd run down to the intersection here, and then they could just make the choice. They could either run into this left arm, where there were 2 sugar pellets waiting for them. It's nice and easy, they could just run in freely. Or they could choose to climb over this barrier, it's 30 centimeters tall, and get 4 sugar pellets. And so a foot may not seem like that much, but to a rat, that's a bit of a scrabble, right? They got to do a bit of work to do that. Turns out rats are a lot like squirrels. They can actually jump really, really high. So if you want to be terrified, imagine those rats you see jumping at you like a squirrel does. It's amazing. But what you find is that what you're doing here really is you're saying, do you want to have a high reward or a large reward but put in some effort, or have a low reward with very little effort? So you're giving the rats a choice. You're letting them do some decision making. And what they found is that over time, at baseline, just when the rats can do whatever they want, in general, they're happy to do a little bit of extra work in order to get twice as many sugar pellets. You know, a little bit of work and it pays off. But when you give this dopamine antagonist, so this is a drug again that blocks dopamine, what you find is that these rats switch their preferences. So they're no longer interested in going over the barrier. Instead, they all turn and go into the low effort option. So all of these rats no longer want to put in the work. They just want the smaller reward. So you might ask yourself, and this is when you're blocking dopamine. So you might ask yourself, well, maybe it's just because these sugar pellets taste less good, and that's why they're going in to this side now. Or maybe it's because they're confused or stupid or something. Or maybe they're no longer able to climb it. So you have to do a third condition, which is that in the third condition, you give them the drug again. It's blocking dopamine. They run down to the intersection. But now this time, the barrier is gone. And so now they can just run freely into the side with lots and lots of sugar pellets and the side with no sugar, or with fewer sugar pellets. And so if it was a problem with pleasure, what you would expect is that they'd sort of choose indifferently, or at least sort of, it would be, you wouldn't see the same pattern. But what you see is that what the animals do is that they all switch their behavior again. Now that this is open, they're happy to go in and get lots and lots of these sugar pellets. So it's not that they don't get any pleasure from taking or from eating the sugar pellets, it's that they don't want to put in the effort, they don't want to put in the work. And this sort of gets into the essential thing of what dopamine is doing. Dopamine is not a pleasure molecule, it's a motivation molecule. So it's the thing that, it's the system that will overall encourage your, the rest of your brain to be driven toward doing some sort of motivated behavior. And that might sound like a good thing, but that also means the system that motivates you to play more video games when you should be studying, or something like that. Okay, so if you take anything away from today's presentation, it's this, that you should listen to Batman. We've known for a very, very long time that dopamine is not the pleasure molecule. It seems to be the motivation molecule, if you want to give it a fancy name. I would just say it's implicated in motivation. So how does this all link back to addiction? So what we're getting here is that, remember, all of these drugs are increasing the dopamine system. So if you take cocaine or heroin or alcohol or whatever else, you're increasing dopamine function in your system. But you're increasing it to an artificial level, a level that it never normally reaches in nature. So by comparison, if you saw the dopamine signal for to go seek some sugar versus the dopamine signal for receiving cocaine, it's like the cocaine's 1000% more than you would ever get for sugar or something like that. So it's this artificial dopamine signal you're injecting into your body. And so what that means is that it's intensely motivating, and also that anything around it will also sort of accrue some of this dopamine signal. So what happens is that as you're using drugs, there are all these stimuli around you. It's your dirtbag friend who you always use with, or the neighborhood where you always go, or the crappy old apartment that you live in like a basement, or the drug paraphernalia, right? The lighter or the needle or whatever else. So these things, previously they had no value, but because they're always around you when you are using, this dopamine signal essentially says, hey, these are incredibly valuable things. So when you see these drug stimuli, like a lighter or whatever, it elicits cravings. So if you wander into your old neighborhood, suddenly you want to use again. And this sort of explains important elements that withdrawal can't explain. And so what you sort of get is this, which is any user, especially, cigarettes, you never even have a liking to begin with. I'll never understand cigarettes, but over time what you see is that with virtually any substance, the initial use, the liking is never higher than that first hit. And you talk to people who've used cocaine and they are very explicit about that. They're like, I've never had the same experience as I did the first time I used cocaine. And so they're constantly chasing this high, this pleasure feeling, but the actual pleasure of using the drug goes down and down, which lines up really well with what people say when you ask them. And they say, I don't actually really enjoy using heroin very much, I just have to use it. And on the other hand, that as you use it, that dopamine signal is more and more causing this motivation to increase. So you're more and more motivated to seek the drug, even though you're enjoying the drug less and less and less. And so what is this sort of related to? I'm not going to go into this too much, but the idea is that we've done these studies in monkeys, it's amazing. So one of the things that dopamine does is at first when you give a delicious grape juice reward, as we all do, we have this huge surge of dopamine in our brains. But over time, the reward itself, what happens is that if we start to give a signal, so we show a little bit of light that shows up, a couple seconds before the grape juice reward is going to happen. What happens is that the dopamine signal for the reward goes away and it shifts over to signaling at the light. So in other words, when the light is present, we're like, oh yeah, the grape juice is coming, and that's when you get your dopamine signal. And then finally, same thing, so you show the light here and you have this big strong dopamine signal, but all of a sudden you don't reward with any grape juice, and your dopamine system's like, hey, this is not what we were expecting, this is way worse. And so essentially how your dopamine system, one of the ways it acts is like, it's comparing what you expected to what actually happened. So it gets called all sorts of things, but it's this error prediction system or motivational learning system. Essentially, this is how you learn, oh, if I do this thing and work hard and it pays off, it will pay off. And so this is a teaching signal for what you should chase after and what you shouldn't. So you can imagine that when you take drugs, what happens is at first you get this crazy dopamine artificial signal here, and over time all the cues around the drugs, the needles and your friends and everything else, eventually gain this very strong dopamine signal that they normally wouldn't. So normally you wouldn't have, I don't have any love for a lighter, but now if you're addicted to cigarettes and you see somebody just absolutely flicking a lighter, it'll elicit cravings in you, is the idea. Okay. So really, like I said, what it's really doing is this teaching signal or a motivational signal. And it seems to be these two regions in particular. That first one that the electrode study hit, the ventral tegmental area, is just this big dopamine projection into the brain. I think the next one. So what's really interesting is that when you look across the brain, these are from separate sets of studies. When you look across the brain, you see all these long-term changes in how the brain functions due to addictive drugs. So I've talked about this already, but some of the regions include like changes in the prefrontal cortex, changes in the reward circuit as you might expect, but changes in hippocampus and amygdala. These are areas for emotion or spatial learning and memory, things like that. What's interesting is that the areas that are changing are the ones that are receiving innervation from this dopamine area, the ventral tegmental area. So you can see these are, like I said, these are from different sets of studies, but they're targeting the dopamine areas, or the areas that are targeted by dopamine are the ones that are being changed by long-term drug use. So addiction very much seems to be a dopamine story. We are adding an artificial level of dopamine into our system. It's hijacking our system and motivating us to seek things that normally we wouldn't be motivated to seek. Okay, so that's sort of the two theories of addiction. This withdrawal theory is important, of course, like I said, especially with things like opioids, but really to understand how it's working, you really need to understand this dopamine side. So what can we do? Unfortunately, not very much. We've got all sorts of ideas of what might work, whether it's detoxification, so that withdrawal theory, or playing on withdrawal theory, that if you let somebody dry out, they'll be better. But now you should have an idea of why that doesn't work. One, their system may revert back to normal in many ways, but the dopamine system has changed some of these other places, and so if they go back to their old neighborhood, and that inspires them to use these drugs again, then they will. You can try drug replacement therapy, which a lot of people have a moral issue with. The idea is that you're trying to replace a more harmful drug with a more societally acceptable one, and that's, I'll show you, is actually relatively the best success rate that we get. Behavioral therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy, so teaching people to to avoid or how to think differently about these. And again, nominal successes I'll show you. And then of course, 12-step programs, relying on a higher power and going through some sort of anonymous program. So success rates, like I said, aren't very good. So this is, we're showing people who didn't relapse essentially. And so you see that when you give methadone instead of the drug that they were using before, heroin, you can see that a good chunk of them, after 5 years anyway, will be clean. So they'll stay clean. But this is the best we have, and that's still only a 30% success rate, right? So somebody was on heroin and then they get off heroin by using methadone. That's a pretty successful way of doing it by comparison to all of these other. So these are detox programs here, and these are sort of your long-term things here, and these are for 2 different drugs. But you can see the success rates are really, really low. These drugs are really getting to you, get their hooks into you, and the problem is, like I said, this dopamine side, that suddenly the lighters and your friend and your neighborhood have this intense incentive salience, right? So they have this motivational quality. So when you go back to your old neighborhood, you start craving again. So part of the problem isn't just about treating the drug issue. What it is that you need to, if somebody wants to get clean, then what they need to do is get out of the life that they've been living in. You need to get them out of poverty and stress. You need to get them into a different neighborhood with different friends. And it's all well and good to say that out loud, but when neuroscientists tell policymakers that, they're like, well, don't you have some sort of brain drug or something I can give them? Because they don't want to hear about social policy from a brain guy, which is fair, I guess. I don't know. And so, like I said before, part of the trouble in treating addiction are these long-term changes. So this is these individuals here in the addicted column, they're all clean. But you can see that after long-term drug use, you've fundamentally changed how the dopamine system is working. So again, these are dopamine-rich areas, and they become hypoactive, and so you are more inclined to go seeking dopamine, or in other words, more inclined to go seeking more drugs. And this is sort of what you get. This is from my very first paper, so pardon, apologies for the extraordinarily Microsoft PowerPoint design of it. So you have some, this can start anywhere, but essentially you have a terrible experience as a child. This impairs the functioning in this reward system and changes how dopamine functions, which makes you more impulsive and have less behavioral flexibility. And all of this makes you more inclined to use the substance. This can lead to addiction, and long-term use of a substance then further impairs this system. So you get into this feed-forward cycle. Again, it doesn't sound very pleasant to talk about it like this, but it seems like the best solution is really to get people out of their neighborhoods, or to get people away from the stimuli that are eliciting the cravings, eliciting the urges to have the drugs. So, at this point you can answer most of these questions. So are you addicted to food? Are you addicted to gambling? The basic criteria you want to ask yourself are, do I have cravings? Is there an escalation of intake, escalation of burgers, I guess? Is there withdrawal state? These like reasonable questions. And then the most important one, of course, is it having an adverse impact on my life? Like, do I wish my life was better and different? Like, do I wish I could get off it? So you can apply all of these principles to other addictions, behavioral addictions as they're often categorized. Within the DSM, the statistical manual for people who want to diagnose for mental health, there's only one behavioral addiction currently listed, and that's for gambling, pathological gambling. But there might be more added in the future. All of these things are acting, it turns out, on the same system, which is dopamine. And I showed you the grape juice before, so it should make sense. Things that have a reinforcing quality are going to play on the dopamine system. That doesn't in and of itself mean that you were addicted to your smartphone, though. But if it has similar things like escalation and withdrawal states, and it's, for some individuals, whether it's food or especially gambling seems to be the easiest sell for these people. Clearly are showing many of the hallmarks of addiction, including a dysfunctional dopamine system. But you imagine it is different, right? Because you're not throwing all this artificial level of dopamine into your body. It's just it's from the behavior. You're doing this thing that's causing a big rush. Okay, very quickly, this is just showing again, similar to the grape juice study, that when the more and more sugar you give, you get a bigger and bigger release of dopamine related to the reward. So again, dopamine is not about the pleasure, though. It's what it's teaching. Your brain is saying, hey, something good just happened. We should pay attention to all the things around it, just in case of doing any of those things will lead to a good result. Like maybe I got this sugar because I snapped my fingers or because I did a certain thing. So this is your brain desperately trying to learn what it did in order to deserve that reward. Yeah, I liked this study a lot. This was really recently on Neuroscience News, where true nerds go every day. But I love this idea. They were looking at smartphone use, and what they found was that smartphone use isn't antisocial behavior. You're not on your smartphone because you're trying to avoid the rest of the world. It turns out that the things that people get really quote-unquote addicted to are the ones that have the largest social components to it. So whether it's, I don't know what the kids are into these days, but the ones where you are communicating and having these reinforcing interactions with your friends, those are the ones you're hooked on. So what it really seems like is that we have this, that social interactions are motivating. We know this, right? They feel good. It feels good to have a good conversation with your friends. And so when you seem like you're addicted to your phone, what that really is that you're seeking that social reward a lot of the time. So kind of cool. And then just finally, sort of one more little piece of evidence to reinforce this is that you can create these strange states, or you can change behavioral states just by changing the dopamine system in a way that doesn't give you a high. So a lot of in Parkinson's disease, like I talked about before, they usually give dopamine replacement therapy. But once in a while, they can prescribe a drug that just increases the dopamine system function. It's relatively mild and doesn't seem to have any hedonic effects, doesn't make you feel good necessarily. But if the dose is wrong, you end up with all sorts of these weird things like inappropriate masturbation or compulsive shopping online or shoplifting habit or mortgaging or gambling away your entire mortgage, things like that. And these things happen all the time where someone with Parkinson's disease will end up going bankrupt and estranged from their family just because of these drugs and not realizing the effect that they're having. So this whole system of dopamine and motivation and motivated goal-directed behavior seems to be all linked together with addiction. So final thoughts, addiction is complex, right? We've got at least this withdrawal side and the whole learning and motivation side. Avoiding withdrawal symptoms is a component, especially seems to play a role in ones where the withdrawal state comes really quickly, like opioids, which includes oxycodone and oxycontin. But the major component seems to be about how drugs are hijacking that dopamine system. Like I said, they're teaching your brain to act differently over time via these artificially high levels of dopamine. There probably are behavioral addictions, but it's not the same, especially because the level of dopamine that you're putting in your system is not nearly as high. And when we're talking about successful treatment, we really need to be treating an individual's life rather than the addiction itself. We need to think about what's going on in their mental health condition, what's going on in their home life, are they suffering from abuse or trauma or neglect or something else? What can we do to better their life? And that will most likely get them, that's the best indicator of success in getting them away from drugs. That is that. I'm happy to take questions, but thanks so much for listening and for your patience.